Hey everyone, and welcome back to Sleep Among Titans. So the title of our journey tonight is History's Biggest Cover-Up. And I know what you're thinking. Aliens, secret societies, a lost library full of forbidden knowledge. Spoiler alert, it's none of those. History's biggest cover-up, if you can even call it that, wasn't a conspiracy. It was just terrible PR. A whole millennium got stuck with a dreadful nickname, the Dark Ages, and it never really shook it off. So tonight we're not going on a paranoid investigation. We're just going to adjust the lighting. To do that, we have to go somewhere incredibly quiet. Picture a single point of light in a vast sleeping world. Inside a cold stone monastery, a lone monk is hunched over a desk. The only sound is the gentle scratch of his quill on parchment. He's not fighting dragons. He's fighting the slow creeping tide of forgetting one beautiful handwritten letter at a time. And honestly, thank goodness he did. This monk preserving the past in the dim candlelight is our starting point. But he wasn't the only light. We'll soon find others, the farmer learning new ways to work the land, the powerful abbess, who advised kings, and yes, even the Vikings, who were a lot more than just horned helmets and bad press. We'll see how it all connects, so get comfortable, settle in, and let's find the light that was never truly extinguished. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It helps us keep the candles burning here at the channel. So to understand our lonely monk and his candle, we first have to understand the world outside his stone walls. When we think of the fall of Rome, our brains usually conjure up something spectacular. You know, fire chaos, bearded guys in animal pelts storming the gates, the whole dramatic blockbuster scene. But for most people living through it, it wasn't a single loud event. It was more like a slow, quiet fade. Like a radio station gradually losing its signal replaced by static. The change was so slow you might not have noticed it day to day. One year, the magnificent stone road that ran to the next province was perfectly maintained. A decade later, the weeds were starting to win. The grand aqueduct that fed the city fountains just sprung a leak that nobody knew how to fix until one day the water just sputtered and stopped. That fancy wine from Gaul, or the olive oil from Spain. It simply stopped showing up at the market. Basically, the massive interconnected system that was Rome just quietly powered down. Your world shrank. It became your village, maybe the next town over if the road was still clear. Life became intensely local, and in that quiet, in that stillness, people had to adapt. This is where our real story begins, not with the fall of an empire, but with what ordinary people did the day after. How does a farmer feed his family when the old supply lines are gone? How does a community find shelter and meaning in the beautiful empty shells the old world left behind? We'll start by returning to that monastery to see just how they turned that quiet into their greatest strength. What do you think that silence must have felt like? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for joining us on Sleep Among Titans. Alright, so, we've established the setting, the wider world has gone quiet, the grand Roman system has faded to static, and life has become incredibly local. But I also said that some places knew exactly what to do with silence. So let's step out of the wind and into one of those places. Let's go back to that monastery. We need to give our heroic scribe a name, I think. Let's call him Brother Thomas. Now, Brother Thomas wasn't living in some kind of cozy, book-lined retreat with a nice cup of tea. His life, and the life of every monk in his abbey, was governed by a strict, unchanging, and frankly grueling rhythm. It was a rhythm marked not by a clock on the wall, but by the tolling of a great bronze bell. This rhythm was called the Liturgy of the Hours, or the Divine Office. And it was the engine that drove their entire world. His day would start long before dawn. Sometime around 2 a.m. the bell would ring out across the cold, dark grounds. This wasn't a gentle alarm you could snooze, it was a command. He and his brothers would rise from their simple straw mattresses, pull on their coarse wool habits, and make their way through the pitch-black, freezing cloister to the chapel for the first service vigils. Imagine that. Chanting prayers in a stone chapel, the only light from a few flickering candles, your breath pluming in the air. This was an act of pure discipline. After an hour or so of prayer and readings, they might go back to bed for a short while, but soon the bell would ring again for Lauds the dawn prayer, just as the first grey light began to streak the sky. After Lauds, the real workday began. This is where the magic and the sheer hard work happened. Brother Thomas's workplace was the scriptorium, and again, forget any cosy images. The scriptorium was often a cold, unheated room, sometimes built over the warming room or kitchen, to get some residual heat, but usually not. It was built with large windows because light was essential, but glass was a rare luxury. More often it was polished horn or oiled parchment that let in a dim filtered light. And there was one golden rule in the scriptorium silence: absolute profound silence. Now let's talk about the technology, because what they were doing was the high tech of its day. First you needed something to write on. This wasn't a quick trip to the supply store for a ream of paper. No Brother Thomas was writing on vellum or parchment, which is a fancy way of saying painstakingly prepared animal skin. The process was long and, let's be honest, pretty gross. You'd take the skin of a calf, a sheep or a goat, soak it in lime water for days to loosen the hair, then stretch it taut on a wooden frame. Then came the scraping. With a special curved knife, a monk would scrape away every last bit of hair and flesh. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Then he'd treat it, smooth it with pumice stone until it was like a thin, creamy, durable sheet. A single large book like a Bible could require the skins of over 100 animals. When you hold an old manuscript, you're not just holding a story, you're holding a flock. Next, the ink. The most common kind was iron gall ink. It was made by mixing crushed oak galls, those little woody growths on oak trees, with iron sulfate, and a binder like gum arabic. It was acidic, and when applied to the vellum it didn't just sit on top, it literally bit into the surface, becoming a permanent part of the page. This was the original unsendable message. And finally the pen, a quill. Usually a goose feather cured and hardened with the tip sharpened to a precise point with a penknife. A knife he had to keep with him at all times because the point would wear down constantly. So picture Brother Thomas. He has his sheet of vellum, his pot of ink, his sharpened quill. He's sitting at his slanted desk in the cold, silent room. His job for the next 6 hours is to copy a text. Maybe it's a passage from the Gospels. Maybe it's a work by a Roman author like Virgil that would otherwise have been lost forever. He couldn't just lean back. He had to lean in with intense, unwavering focus. There is no backspace key, no undo button. One slip of the hand, one moment of lost concentration could ruin an entire page that took days of work and a whole sheep to create. He was less a writer and more a high-stakes slow-motion tattoo artist. And while he did this, another monk and illuminator might be working on another page, adding the breathtaking artwork. The vibrant colours made from ground-up minerals and plants. The shimmering gold leaf that seemed to catch the divine light. And sometimes in the margins they'd add the most wonderfully weird doodles: knights fighting snails, monkeys playing bagpipes, rabbits enacting revenge on their human hunters. Little glimpses of humour and humanity in the midst of a sacred task. The bell would ring again for prayer at midday sext, and again in the afternoon, none. Each time a break from the strain, a moment to recenter before returning to the silent work. Finally, as the sun began to set, the bell for vespers would signal the end of the workday. He would carefully clean his quill cap, his ink, and go to evening prayers, his back aching and his fingers cramped. After a simple supper, one final service compline, and after that the great silence began. No talking at all by anyone until the next morning. This was his life. A cycle of prayer and work, silence and bells. It seems monotonous, but that very rhythm, that unwavering discipline, was the machine that saved Western civilization's written heritage. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't a battle, but it was a quiet, determined war against the entropy of time itself. But of course, this structured, literate world was a tiny island in a vast ocean. What was life like for the other 99% of the population whose days were governed not by a bell, but by the sun and the seasons? We'll look at that next. Alright, so we've just spent a day in the highly structured, silent and literate world of Brother Thomas and his monastery. A world governed by the tolling of a bell dedicated to the preservation of words. It's a beautiful and vital part of our story. But it's crucial to remember that for every one monk like Thomas there were thousands upon thousands of other people. People whose lives were not silent, whose work was not delicate, and whose world was governed by forces far older and more powerful than any bell. Now we're going to leave the cloister and walk out into the fields, into the world of the common farmer. Let's give him a name too. Let's call him Cedric. Cedric's alarm clock wasn't a bell. It was the first crack of sunlight hitting his face through the doorway of his hut. His calendar wasn't a carefully written book. It was the feel of the air, the angle of the sun, the hardness of the ground beneath his bare feet. He couldn't read or write, but he could read the sky for rain better than any scholar could read Latin. His was a world of profound practical knowledge. His home wasn't a grand stone abbey. He lived in what we'd call a wattle and daub hut. Imagine a simple wooden frame with walls made of woven lattice, the wattle caked with a thick mixture of wet soil, clay sand and straw the daub. The roof was thatch. There was one room, not one bedroom, one room. This was where he, his wife, his children, and in the dead of winter probably a prized goat or a few chickens all lived together. Forget open plan living. This was everything plan living. In the centre of the hut was a hearth, a fire pit. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let some of the smoke out. It was constantly hazy, and the walls were permanently blackened with soot. But this fire was the heart of their existence. It was their light in the crushing darkness of night, their warmth against the bitter cold, and the place where every single meal was cooked. And the work was everything. Cedric's life was a partnership with the soil, and it was a demanding partner. His most important piece of technology was likely a heavy-wheeled plough pulled by a team of oxen. This thing was a beast. It was so heavy and expensive that a single family like Cedric's probably didn't own one. The village likely shared a team, and so ploughing wasn't a solitary job. It was a community effort, all of them out in the fields together, shouting at the slow-plodding oxen, turning over the heavy wet clay soil of northern Europe. They were likely using a clever innovation called the three-field system. It was basically a diet plan for the earth. They'd divide the village's land into 3 massive fields. In one, they'd plant a grain like wheat or rye in the autumn. In the second, they'd plant things like oats, barley or beans in the spring. And the third field, they'd leave it completely empty or fallow to let it rest and recover its nutrients for a year. It was a simple, brilliant way to increase the food supply and prevent the soil from becoming exhausted. But this system meant that life was an endless cycle of labour dictated by the seasons. Spring was a time of frantic work and fragile hope. As the ground thawed, it was time for ploughing and planting the second field. Every muscle in Cedric's body would ache from sunup to sundown, and with the seeds in the ground came the anxiety. Would there be enough rain or too much? A late frost could kill everything. Summer brought the longest days and the most grueling labour. The crops grew, but so did the weeds. It was a constant battle pulling them by hand under the hot sun. Then came haymaking, cutting and drying the grass that would be the only winter food for the precious livestock. Autumn was the moment of truth, the harvest. The entire community, men, women and children, would work together in the fields to bring in the grain. The sound of scythes swinging in unison, the feeling of the sharp chaff on your skin. If the harvest was good, there would be a brief joyous celebration, a feast, some drinking a rare moment of relief from the constant pressure of survival. But then came winter. Winter was not a wonderland. It was a siege. The days grew short and dark. The world outside became hostile, frozen. Life retreated indoors into that single smoky room. This was the season of survival. They would huddle around the fire, mending tools, weaving coarse cloth from wool, and all the while they would watch their food stores. Every piece of dried meat, every scoop of grain was precious. A long, hard winter could mean the difference between life and death. The quiet fear of hunger was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the whistling of the wind. Cedric's life was tied to his village and to the local lord who owned the land. He wasn't a slave, but he wasn't exactly free either. He owed the lord a share of his harvest and several days of labour each week, in exchange for his small strip of land and, in theory, protection. And at the centre of this world, both physically and spiritually, was the small parish church. A simple stone or wood building, but it was the anchor of their lives. Its bell might ring to warn of a raid, or to call everyone in from the fields. It's where you were baptised into the community, where you were married, and where you would finally be buried in the churchyard. It offered a profound promise that this life of endless toil and hardship was temporary, and a reward awaited in the next. Cedric didn't write history. He didn't illuminate manuscripts or advise kings. He was the foundation. His sweat, his knowledge of the land and his resilience were the engine that fueled the entire medieval world, including the quiet contemplations of Brother Thomas. So we have these two parallel worlds, the structured, literate life of the monastery and the earthy, cyclical life of the farm. But there was a third element, the ghost of the world that came before. What happened when people like Cedric started interacting with the beautiful forgotten things the Romans had left behind, when the past wasn't something you read about, but something you could literally live inside? That's where we'll go next. Okay, so we have these two coexisting worlds. We have the disciplined, literate world of Brother Thomas inside his monastery, and the earthy, cyclical world of Cedric the farmer out in his fields. They seem completely separate, but they shared their landscape with a third silent and colossal character, the ghost of Rome. When the Roman Empire faded in the West, it didn't just vanish. It left things behind. A staggering amount of stuff, really. Think of it as the tide line after a great civilization has receded. And for people like Cedric and Thomas, this wasn't ancient history. It was just there. A collection of beautiful, baffling, and incredibly useful structures that dotted their entire world. Their relationship with these ruins tells us so much about them. The most practical relationship, of course, was simply seeing the ruins as the world's largest, most convenient hardware store. Imagine you're building a new church for your village. You need stone. You could spend months quarrying new blocks from the hills, a dangerous and back-breaking job. Or you could just go to the half-crumbled Roman temple a mile down the road. It's got perfectly cut, high-quality stone blocks, just sitting there for the taking. The choice was obvious. It was the ultimate recycling program born out of pure necessity. Walls of Roman bathhouses became the foundations for churches. Perfectly good Roman roof tiles were stripped and placed on new medieval homes. There was even a sort of iron rush. The Romans had a clever trick of using iron clamps deep inside their stonework to hold massive blocks together. For a medieval blacksmith struggling to find enough precious iron, these ruins were mines. You'd see people chipping away at magnificent marble columns not to destroy them out of malice, but to get at the small, priceless metal clamp hidden inside. The past wasn't just being repurposed. It was being dissected for its most valuable parts. But it gets even more intimate than that. They didn't just take the ruins apart, they moved in. Let's imagine Cedric has a cousin. We'll call him Odo. Odo's family doesn't live in a smoky wattle and daub hut. They got lucky. They found an abandoned Roman villa. The roof might be gone in parts, exposing it to the sky, but the walls are thick stone and the floors are magic. They are covered in breathtaking mosaics. Tiny coloured stones assembled into images of gods and goddesses, spiralling patterns and strange sea creatures. Now picture Odo's family living their simple medieval life against this backdrop of faded grandeur. They build a fire pit for their cooking right in the middle of a stunning depiction of Neptune riding his chariot. The god of the sea once worshipped is now just the part of the floor that's easy to sweep. Odo's children don't see a priceless work of art. They see a fantastic, durable, waterproof surface, a great place to play a game with knucklebones. Their little world of mud and farming is contained within the elegant bones of a forgotten palace. It's a strange and beautiful collision of worlds. You'd see it everywhere. A shepherd caught in a sudden downpour would shelter his flock not under a tree, but within the stone arches of a vast empty amphitheatre where gladiators once fought. The roar of the crowd, long silenced, is replaced by the gentle bleating of sheep and the drumming of rain on ancient stone. The past wasn't just a memory, it was a roof over your head. And of course, because they couldn't possibly understand the engineering that built these things, they did what all humans do when faced with the inexplicable. They made up stories. They looked at a massive aqueduct striding for miles across the landscape on impossible arches and concluded it couldn't possibly be the work of men. It must have been built by giants. Old Roman tombs with their strange inscriptions and underground chambers became known as the homes of fairies, elves, or dragons. You didn't disturb those places if you knew what was good for you. A perfectly straight Roman road cutting across hills and valleys with an unnatural logic was often called a devil's highway, or Goliath's path, because surely only a supernatural being could create something so arrow-straight. So you see, the past wasn't something distant or dead to them. It was a living part of their world. It was a quarry for their churches, a home for their families, and a landscape for their myths. They were walking, sleeping and farming in the footsteps of sleeping gods every single day. This act of living with the past, of repurposing and preserving bits and pieces of it through sheer pragmatism, was a kind of passive survival of knowledge. But in some places the work had to be far more deliberate. In isolated pockets at the very edge of the known world, the flame of knowledge was being guarded with incredible care, far away from the crumbling villas and repurposed temples. We'll travel to one of those remote sanctuaries next, of course. Here is the script for segment 4, exploring the vital and unique role of the Irish monasteries. It is crafted to meet the specified length, tone, and structural requirements. The soft, continuous music bed from the previous segment carries on underneath the armrest. Narrator AI voice. So we've explored the world of the farmer Cedric living his life on the continent surrounded by the ghosts of the Roman Empire. He and his family were literally living inside the past, sheltering in its ruins and quarrying its stones. But now, I want you to imagine a place the Romans never reached. An island on the very edge of their maps, a place they knew of but considered not worth the trouble. A place without crumbling villas, without abandoned amphitheatres, and without those famously straight Roman roads. Let's travel west across the sea to the island of Ireland. Because the Romans never conquered it, Ireland was spared the chaos of the empire's collapse. It was in a way protected by its own remoteness. Christianity had trickled in, of course. The story of St. Patrick is the famous version, but the process was more gradual than that. And the form of Christianity that took root here was different. It was wilder, more ascetic. It wasn't organised around bishops in tidy towns. It was built around powerful independent monasteries, often founded in the most remote, inhospitable places you can imagine. And when I say remote, I mean remote. I want you to picture a jagged spike of rock jutting out of the furious grey-green Atlantic Ocean miles from the nearest shore. A place so battered by wind and waves that it seems impossible for anything to survive there. Now picture a group of monks centuries ago getting into small boats made of wood and leather and rowing for hours across that treacherous sea to this very rock. And on this rock they built their monastery. They built tiny stone beehive-shaped huts called clochans clinging to the cliff face like barnacles. Why would they do this? Why choose a place of such extreme hardship? Because for them this wasn't a punishment. It was a paradise. It was a desert in the spiritual sense, a place where they could be utterly alone with God, far from the temptations and noise of the world. They weren't running from something. They were running towards something. And this choice made for purely spiritual reasons had an unintended and monumental historical consequence. It turned these remote Irish monasteries into accidental time capsules. While libraries on the continent were being neglected or looted by raiders, or simply rotting away from damp, the libraries of Ireland were safe. They were protected by 1,000 miles of water and a reputation for having nothing worth stealing. It was a perfect accidental historical airlock, and here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just that they saved books, but which books they saved. On the continent, the church had a complicated relationship with its own Roman past. They were the heirs of Rome, but they were also trying to define themselves in opposition to its paganism. So they focused on the Bible and the writings of the church fathers. The Irish monks didn't have that baggage. For them, Latin wasn't the language of a complicated past. It was a cool, new imported language, and they fell in love with it. They approached it with the passion of dedicated students. They wanted to understand every nuance of its grammar, its poetry, its structure, and so they didn't just copy the Bible. They copied everything they could get their hands on. They were like literature fans who found an ancient forgotten library and decided to read the whole thing. They painstakingly copied the works of the great Roman pagans, Virgil's epic poetry, Cicero's powerful rhetoric, Horace's sharp-witted odes. They even copied Ovid's love poems, which were decidedly not G-rated. You can literally find manuscripts where a monk has copied a sensual pagan poem right next to a solemn passage of scripture. It's a beautiful testament to their pure, unadulterated love of knowledge and language for its own sake. They even invented things we now take for granted. Classical Latin was often written in a continuous block of letters with no spaces between words. It was up to the reader to figure it out. The Irish monks, for whom Latin was a foreign language, found this incredibly difficult. So they started adding spaces between the words to make it easier to read. Think about that for a second. That simple intuitive act was an Irish invention born out of a desire to learn. And the story doesn't end there. They didn't just hoard this knowledge, they felt a duty to share it. These hardy, devoted monks got back into their little leather boats and sailed back to the continent they had left behind. They became the greatest missionaries of the age. Figures like Columbanus, who travelled through a fractured and chaotic France and Italy, founding new monasteries at Luxeuil and Bobbio, two of the most important centres of learning in the entire period. They were like a cultural rescue squad, arriving with their precious cargo of books. They were reseeding a forest that had nearly burned down, bringing back the very classics that the continent itself had begun to forget. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? That in the most remote, storm-blasted corners of the known world, the light of ancient Rome was not only preserved but cherished, ready to be brought back when the time was right. Now, this image of the lone male scholar is a powerful one, but it's incomplete. Some of the most influential centres of learning and political power in this era weren't run by men at all. We'll find out what happened when a woman was in charge next. So far in our journey, the main characters we've met have been men. We've had the patient brother Thomas copying his manuscripts, We've had the hardy farmer Cedric working his fields, and we've had those incredibly tough Irish monks on their storm-battered rocks saving civilization one pagan poem at a time. It's very easy to look at this period and get the impression that it was exclusively a man's world, that women were silent background characters. That impression is profoundly wrong. We've been looking for the hidden lights of this era, and some of the brightest, most influential lights of all were women. We just have to know where to look. We need to turn our attention away from the monk's cell and towards the abbess's chair. In a world where options for women were starkly limited, you were basically a wife and mother or you were a nun, the path of the church could paradoxically offer incredible freedom and power. For a woman of intelligence, ambition and piety, becoming the abbess of a major monastery wasn't just a spiritual calling. It was like becoming the CEO of a multinational corporation, the chancellor of a university, and a major political player all rolled into one. And there is no better example of this than a Northumbrian noblewoman named Hilda. Hilda of Whitby is one of the most formidable figures of the entire era. She founded a monastery at Whitby, perched on a dramatic cliff overlooking the cold grey North Sea. And this wasn't just a nunnery. It was a double monastery home to a community of both monks and nuns. And who was in charge of everyone, men included? Hilda was. Her authority was absolute. But she didn't just rule, she taught. Under her guidance, the abbey at Whitby became one of the most important centres of learning in all of Britain. The library there was renowned. And get this, no fewer than 5 of the men who studied under her went on to become bishops, the highest rank in the church. One even became a saint. She wasn't just running a monastery, she was forging the spiritual and intellectual leaders of her generation. And she was also a nurturer of native art. There's a beautiful story about a man at her monastery named Cedric. He was an illiterate cowherd, and he was deeply embarrassed that he couldn't sing or compose verses like others did during feasts. One night, the story goes, he had a dream in which a figure commanded him to sing about the creation of the world. And suddenly this unlearned man began to compose the most beautiful poetry in his own language, Old English. When Hilda heard about this, she didn't dismiss it. She recognized the miracle and the talent. She brought Cedric into the monastery, had him educated in the scriptures, and then tasked him with turning those sacred stories into poems that his own Anglo-Saxon people could understand. She became the patron of the very first known English poet, but her influence went even higher. In the year 664, the King of Northumbria had to make a huge decision. The church in his kingdom was divided. Some followed the traditions of the Irish monks, we just met the Celtic style, while others followed the traditions of Rome. It affected everything right down to how they calculated the date of Easter. The king decided to hold a great meeting, a synod, to settle the matter once and for all. And the venue he chose for this landmark event, where all the most powerful bishops and nobles would debate, he chose Hilda's abbey at Whitby. She was the host. Her wisdom and authority were so respected that her monastery was seen as the perfect neutral ground for settling the future of English Christianity. That is power. And this thread of female influence, pun intended, ran through the entire fabric of the age. While the men were often focused on stone and scripture, the women were masters of another medium, textiles. In the workshops of these abbeys, women practiced the high art of embroidery and weaving. This wasn't a quaint hobby. They created vast, intricate tapestries and stunning silk vestments for priests. These items were worth more than their weight in gold. They were diplomatic gifts between kingdoms, symbols of immense wealth and piety. They were in their own way as important as any manuscript. They were another way of telling stories, of preserving culture, of weaving the very fabric of their society. So when we talk about the Dark Ages, part of what was left in the dark was the immense contribution of women like Hilda. They were administrators, scholars, artists, and political counsellors. They were not footnotes to history, they were writing it. We've now seen these various pockets of light, these centres of building and creating and preserving. But all of it, the monastery, the farm, the Irish rock, the abbess's abbey, was about to be put to the ultimate test. A storm was gathering in the north, a storm of dragon-headed ships and fearless warriors who would sail down from Scandinavia and challenge everything these people thought they knew about faith, fear, and survival. But before that storm breaks, we need to take a breath. Our next step will be a quiet interlude, a transition. We're going to follow the strange journey of a single silent object as it passes through all these different worlds we've just visited. We've visited worlds of immense effort and quiet faith. The monk in his scriptorium, the farmer in his field, the abbess in her hall of power. We've seen how they built their lives, preserved their past, and found meaning in their work. But before we move forward, before the storm we've hinted at finally breaks, I want to pause. Let's take a breath. For this next part of our journey, we're going to step away from the people. We're going to follow something else. Something small, silent, and in its own way far more durable than any person. We're going to follow the life of a single silver coin. Let's imagine it new and sharp from the mint in the heart of Rome. It's a denarius struck in the reign of the Emperor Trajan. On one side, the emperor's noble bearded profile, a man at the peak of his power. On the other, a depiction of Fortuna, the goddess of luck. The Latin letters are crisp and clear. It's heavy. It feels important. It is important. Its story begins in the hand of a young legionary. We'll call him Lucius. He's from a sunny villa in southern Gaul, but he's been posted to the misty northern edge of the world, a fort along Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. The coin is part of his pay. He keeps it in a small leather pouch. On a cold, damp night, huddled by a brazier, he might pull it out. It's a tangible piece of home, a reminder of the immense orderly power that sent him here. It's a promise of the pension he'll receive, the farm he'll buy when his service is done. One day at a bustling market near his fort, Lucius buys a loaf of coarse bread and some local cheese from a British woman. As he fumbles with his pouch, the denarius slips through his cold fingers. It lands with a soft thud in the mud and straw of the street. He doesn't notice. He moves on. The coin is lost. It is pressed down into the earth by the heel of a sandal, the hoof of a mule, the wheel of a cart. The sounds of the Roman market fade. The world moves on without it. Now the coin begins its long, quiet sleep. It knows nothing of the world above. It only feels the slow, rhythmic pressure of the seasons. The deep cold of winter, freezing the ground solid around it. The gentle thaw of spring as meltwater trickles past its silver face. The summer sun baking the earth above as the roots of weeds and wildflowers snake their way around it. Years pass, then decades, then centuries. The Roman fort is abandoned. The market town withers. The stone walls crumble. The road becomes a grassy track. The coin does not care. It is patient. It waits. One day, long after the name of Lucius has been forgotten, long after the empire he served has become a memory, a young girl is digging in the earth for edible roots. She is not Roman. She is a Saxon. Her name is Elswith. Her fingers grubby from the soil brush against something hard and round. Curious, she digs it out. It's not a stone. It's cool and heavy. She rubs the dirt away. The silver is tarnished and dark, but it still gleams. She sees the faint outline of a man's face, a strange man with a beard and a laurel wreath. The letters mean nothing to her. She cannot read, and even if she could, this is a dead language. To her, this is not money. It's magic, a fairy coin. A piece of treasure left by the giants who her grandfather told her built the old stone walls nearby. She takes it back to her village. Her father, with a simple awl, drills a crude hole near the edge. She threads a leather thong through it and wears it around her neck. The face of a dead Roman emperor now rests against the warm skin of a living Saxon child. Its purpose has completely changed. It is no longer a tool of commerce, but an object of wonder, a personal talisman. More time passes. Elswith grows up, has children of her own. The coin, her lucky charm, is always with her. But one day the peace of her village is shattered. Dragon-headed ships appear on the river. Men with axes and beards of their own men from the north leap from the boats. In the chaos of the raid, the coin is taken. It is thrown into a sack with other loot. Its new owner is a Viking craftsman. He is a practical man. He does not see a fairy coin or a strange face. He sees good silver. Back in his workshop in a new town called Jorvik, he takes the coin and throws it into a clay crucible with other broken bits of jewellery. He places the crucible in the heart of a roaring fire. The coin heats up. The face of Trajan, which has survived for 700 years, begins to soften. The letters blur. The goddess Fortuna wavers, and then dissolves into a shimmering liquid pool. The coin, as a coin, is no more. Its individual history has been erased, but its substance remains. The Viking pours the molten silver into a mould. When it cools, he works it, twisting it into intricate swirling patterns, the forms of snarling beasts biting their own tails. The silver that once paid a Roman soldier is now part of a magnificent brooch, a masterpiece of Viking art used to fasten the heavy wool cloak of a northern warrior. The silver's journey has come full circle. It was a symbol of imperial order, then a child's lucky charm, and now a key part of the dynamic, chaotic and creative new world that has taken Rome's place. And perhaps that Viking, fearing a battle or an uncertain journey, buried his beautiful new brooch in a lead box with the rest of his wealth, deep in the earth, intending to come back for it. And perhaps he never did. The silver sleeps once more, waiting. That single coin witnessed it all. The slow decay, the quiet survival, the violent transformation, and the spark of new creation. Its journey is the story of this era. Nothing is ever truly lost. It is only changed. And now we too must change our focus. We must turn our eyes to the brief shining moment when a new emperor tried to gather all these scattered pieces of the past, all these threads of learning, and forge a new empire from the ashes of the old. We must look at the age of Charlemagne. Our silver coin ended its journey in a Viking's crucible. Its Roman identity melted away, its substance reformed into something new, chaotic and vibrant. For centuries that was the pattern of the world, the old order dissolving its pieces, being repurposed in 1,000 different ways, by 1,000 different hands. It was creative, it was resilient, but it was also messy. But then came a man who looked at all this beautiful, chaotic, raw material and decided it was time to build something again. Something unified, something grand. A man who would become known to history as Charles the Great, or as we know him, Charlemagne. When you hear the name Charlemagne, you probably picture a great warrior, and you're not wrong. He was a brilliant military commander who forged a vast empire across what is now France, Germany, and Italy. But we're not here tonight to talk about his battles with the Lombards or the Saxons. We're here to talk about a different and arguably more difficult conquest, his war against disorganization, ignorance, and really, really bad handwriting. You see, by the late 700s, Charlemagne ruled this huge territory, but it was an administrative nightmare. Imagine trying to run a massive company where every branch office speaks a different dialect, follows a different set of rules, and writes in a unique, illegible scrawl. That was Charlemagne's kingdom. The quality of Latin, the official language of government and the church, had decayed terribly. Priests in different regions were chanting the Mass with wildly different words. Important legal documents were riddled with errors because scribes couldn't properly read the texts they were copying. For Charlemagne, a deeply pious and orderly man, this was unacceptable. He believed a strong Christian empire required clear, correct, and uniform communication. So he started a project that would change the future of Western culture. He started recruiting. From his new capital at Aachen, a city he intended to be a new Rome, he sent out a call for the best and brightest minds in Europe. It was like he was assembling the Avengers of 8th century scholars. From Italy he brought grammarians, from Ireland he brought theologians, and from England he brought the man who would become his superstar, his project manager for civilization itself, a scholar named Alcuin of York. Alcuin was a product of that same Northumbrian Renaissance that gave us the powerful Abbess Hilda. He was one of the most learned men of his time, and in him Charlemagne found the perfect partner. Alcuin's job was to take on the messiest problem of all the writing. At that time, manuscripts were written in a variety of scripts that were frankly a disaster. They were cramped and full of confusing abbreviations and ligatures where letters were squished together. It was slow to write and even slower to read. So under Alcuin's direction, the scholars at Charlemagne's court developed and promoted a new style of writing. It became known as Carolingian minuscule. And I know what you're thinking, a new font, how exciting. But this was revolutionary. It was one of the most important developments in communication ever. The script was clean, clear, and elegant, with beautifully rounded and distinct letter forms. It enthusiastically adopted the Irish practice of putting a space between each word. It introduced the practice of using a capital letter to start a sentence and lowercase letters for the rest. It brought back punctuation. The very letters you're looking at on your screen right now are the direct descendants of this script. It made texts infinitely easier to read, which meant they were easier to copy and much, much harder to copy incorrectly. It was an operating system upgrade for the entire culture. With this new tool, Charlemagne and Alcuin launched their grand project. They created a new corrected and standardized version of the Bible and sent copies out to monasteries across the empire. They reformed the liturgy. They established schools in cathedrals and monasteries to improve the quality of education for clergy and nobles. And what of the great man himself? The funny thing is, Charlemagne, this great patron of letters, was likely illiterate or could only read a little. He tried desperately to learn to write late in life. His biographer tells us he used to keep wax tablets and notebooks under his pillow so he could practice forming the letters in his spare moments. but his hands, long accustomed to gripping the hilt of a sword, were too stiff and clumsy for the delicate work. It's a wonderfully human and poignant image, the most powerful man in Europe who could command armies and reshape the continent, struggling to master the simple shapes that he knew were the key to the future. This period was a brief, brilliant flash of light, a Carolingian Renaissance. For a moment it seemed like a new unified Roman Empire had been reborn. But it was in many ways a false dawn. The unity of the empire depended too much on Charlemagne's own immense force of will. After his death, his sons and grandsons divided it, and it quickly began to fracture again. And that fracturing was about to be brutally accelerated by a new and terrifying force from the sea. The very same Vikings our silver coin met in a crucible were now ready to meet Charlemagne's empire on the battlefield. They saw the new wealth and organisation of Europe not as something to admire, but as a collection of rich, tempting targets. That collision is where our story must go next. We left off in the court of Charlemagne, a brief shining moment of restored order. His empire was an attempt to rebuild the grandeur of Rome, a place of scholarship, standardized texts and clear laws. But this new orderly world was fragile. It depended on strong central leadership, and after Charlemagne died it began to fracture. And into those fresh cracks, like water seeking the path of least resistance, sailed a new and formidable force from the north. Now let's just address the elephant in the room. When you hear the word Viking, your mind probably conjures a very specific image, likely involving a big hairy guy in a horned helmet jumping off a boat and screaming. So, first things first, lose the horns. They were a romantic invention for a 19th century Wagner opera. They had absolutely nothing to do with actual Vikings. And while they certainly did their fair share of screaming and fighting, the full story is, as always, so much more interesting than the cartoon stereotype. To see the world through their eyes, we first need to understand their single greatest achievement, the boat. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of naval engineering. It was long, narrow, and frighteningly fast. But its real genius lay in two key features. First, it was clinker-built, meaning the hull planks overlapped, which gave it incredible strength, but also flexibility, allowing it to bend and ride the waves of the brutal North Atlantic rather than fight them. Second, it had a very shallow draft. This was the game changer. It meant a longship wasn't confined to the coast. It could sail right up rivers deep into the heart of a kingdom, striking at towns and monasteries that thought they were perfectly safe hundreds of miles from the sea. It was a beautiful, elegant, weaponized shark, and it gave them an element of surprise that was completely unnerving to the people of Europe. And let's be clear, they used this advantage to terrifying effect. We can't sugarcoat the reality of the raids. They were brutal. They saw the wealthy but poorly defended monasteries we've talked about, places like the one on the English coast of Lindisfarne, as giant unlocked bank vaults filled with gold chalices and precious books. The violence was real and the fear they inspired was paralyzing. But if we only see them as raiders, we miss the other 90% of the picture. A Viking was at his core an entrepreneur. And raiding was just one very aggressive business model. More often, the business was trade. These people were the greatest voyagers of their age. They established trade routes that crisscrossed the known world. They sailed south, not just to France and Spain, but all the way to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, where they were so respected as warriors. They became the emperor's elite personal bodyguards, the Varangian Guard. They travelled east, dragging their longships between the great rivers of what is now Russia. In fact, the name Russia likely comes from the name the local Slavic tribes gave these Norse traders, the Rus. And they travelled west, out into the vast unknown Atlantic. They settled the empty island of Iceland, creating a new nation with a sophisticated parliamentary system. From there they pushed on to Greenland, and from Greenland around the year 1000 they sailed to North America, landing in what is now Newfoundland nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. They built a small settlement there, a brief, fleeting outpost of Europe on a new continent, and everywhere they went they traded. They brought furs, amber and walrus ivory, the white gold of the north, and exchanged it for Arab silver, Byzantine silk, French wine and fine German metalwork. They weren't just a force of destruction. They were a force of connection, stitching the world together with the wakes of their ships. Finally, they weren't just visitors. They stayed. They were settlers. In England, they conquered and settled a vast territory that became known as the Danelaw, forever changing the English language and culture. Simple everyday words you use: sky skin, leg egg, husband, wife law. They're all gifts from Old Norse. In France, a Viking leader named Rollo was granted a huge chunk of land by the French king, hoping it would stop him from raiding Paris. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen, and here's the amazing part these Vikings adapted with breathtaking speed. Within a generation they had adopted the French language, the Christian religion, and Frankish customs, and just over a century and a half later, in 1066, the descendants of these settled Vikings, the Normans led by William the Conqueror, would cross the Channel and conquer England. In a strange twist of fate, England was ultimately conquered by Vikings, who had taken a crash course in being French. So the Vikings were not just a storm that passed, they were a tide that permanently reshaped the coastline of Europe. They were a violent and disruptive catalyst that forced change. This new, more dangerous world they helped create demanded stronger defences. It demanded walls, and it demanded castles. The age of the great stonemason, which had flickered under Charlemagne, was about to begin in earnest, not just for the glory of God, but for sheer survival. We'll watch them build next. The Viking tides, for the most part, eventually receded. They left behind a Europe that was battered and bruised, but also profoundly changed. The raids had been a terrifying stress test, and they revealed a fatal weakness in the old way of doing things. Wood burns, thatched roofs burn. The memory of watching your church, your monastery, your entire village go up in flames was a trauma that echoed for generations. And so across the continent a collective decision was made, not in a grand council, but in the hearts of 1,000 different communities. They decided to rebuild. But this time they would build in a way that would last. They would build in stone. It was more than an architectural choice, it was a psychological one. It was a statement written in rock for all to see: we're still here, we're not afraid, and we're not going anywhere. This great wave of stone construction that swept across Europe from about the year 1000 onwards is known as the Romanesque style. And that name is a huge clue. It literally means in the Roman manner. Just as Charlemagne had tried to revive Roman learning, these builders were trying to recapture Roman permanence. They looked at the crumbling aqueducts and amphitheatres that still dotted their landscape, and they saw a strength they wanted to emulate. The churches they built were a world away from the slender, light-filled Gothic cathedrals that would come later. Romanesque churches are heavy. They are solid. Frankly, they look less like houses of worship and more like fortresses for God. They have immensely thick walls, often several feet deep. The windows are small, often little more than slits, because the builders hadn't yet perfected the engineering to support a heavy stone roof over large openings. The style was defined by the simple, powerful and incredibly strong rounded arch borrowed directly from the Romans. To step inside one is to be transported. The roof above you is often a huge continuous stone tunnel, a barrel vault, that creates a sense of immense crushing weight and incredible security. But how did they do it? How did a society that we think of as primitive create these monumental structures that still stand today? The answer is slowly and together. Building a new stone church wasn't a commercial construction project. It was a multi-generational act of communal faith. The local lord might provide the money for the materials, but it was the entire community that provided the labour. A farmer like Cedric's great-great-grandson would spend his winters not just mending his tools, but hauling blocks of stone from the quarry in his ox cart. The real heroes of this story are the masons. These were highly skilled, often anonymous craftsmen who would travel from town to town, their tools in a leather roll. They weren't just labourers, they were the engineers and artists of their day. We can imagine them at the quarry listening to the stone, knowing just where to strike with a hammer and wedge to split a clean block. Then the slow, patient work of shaping it with a chisel, ensuring each face was perfectly true. Often a mason would carve a small personal symbol, his mark, into the stones he finished. A quiet signature hidden from view once the stone was in place, known only to him and to God. An immense skeleton of wooden scaffolding would rise around the building, creaking and groaning under the weight of men and stone. They used primitive cranes powered by men walking inside giant wooden wheels to hoist each massive, carefully shaped block into place. And it took time, so much time. A man who helped lay the foundation stones of a great church would know with absolute certainty that he would never live to see the roof completed. His children might not either. Perhaps his grandchildren would be the ones to attend the first service beneath the finished stone vault. It was an act of profound faith, not just in the divine, but in the future, in the generations that would follow. And after a century of work, when it was finally done, imagine being a peasant who has lived his whole life in a small wooden hut, and you step inside for the first time. You leave the bright, noisy, messy world behind and enter a space of cool, cavernous darkness. The air smells of cold stone, damp earth, and decades of burned incense. The only light comes in thin, focused shafts from the high windows illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny captured stars. And the sound, the acoustics of a barrel vault are extraordinary. A single footstep would echo. The priest's chant would be magnified, seeming to come not from a man, but from the very stones themselves from heaven above. It was a space designed to make you feel small, to make you feel protected, and to make you feel part of something vast, ancient, and eternal. These great stone churches were the anchors of the new Europe. They were fortresses of faith, symbols of a newfound stability and confidence. They were a sign that people were no longer just surviving, they were building for eternity. This new stability didn't just fund churches, it funded new kinds of schools. And inside them, a new intellectual energy was sparking to life. A generation of scholars no longer content to just copy the old text began to argue about them, to question them, and to forge a new, more rigorous way of thinking. We'll join them in the classroom next. We've just watched a new Europe being built stone by heavy stone. The great Romanesque churches were a testament to a newfound stability, a society planting its feet firmly in the ground, building for permanence. But at the same time, another kind of construction was underway. A construction not of stone and mortar, but of logic, reason, and fierce, passionate argument. The age of the mason was giving way to the age of the scholar. For centuries, learning had been a quiet, contemplative affair, practiced by monks like Brother Thomas, in the solitude of their scriptoriums. The goal was to preserve the knowledge of the past, to copy it faithfully and without error. But around the 11th and 12th centuries, a new energy began to spark. A generation arose that was no longer content to simply preserve knowledge. They wanted to understand it, to question it, to debate it, and to organize it into a single coherent system. And to do that, they needed a new kind of institution. This was the birth of the university. It didn't start with grand campuses and ivy-covered walls. It started as a spontaneous gathering. A town like Paris or Bologna in Italy or Oxford in England would get a reputation for having a few brilliant teachers, and students hungry for knowledge would simply flock there from all over Europe. They were young, they were often poor, and they formed guilds or universitas to protect themselves just like the Masons had guilds. Forget manicured lawns. Think of a pop-up intellectual festival that just kept going year after year with classes held in rented rooms and church halls. The atmosphere was electric, chaotic, and noisy. But all of this energy needed a spark to ignite it. That spark came from the rediscovery of one of the greatest minds in human history, Aristotle. For most of the early medieval period, Western Europe knew only a tiny fraction of Aristotle's writings, mostly his basic works on logic. The vast bulk of his philosophy, his works on physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, had been lost to them. But they weren't lost to the world. For centuries, these texts had been preserved, studied, and commented upon by brilliant scholars in the Islamic world. And the main point of contact, the place where this lost knowledge re-entered Europe, was Spain. Cities like Toledo in Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus were vibrant multicultural centers where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim intellectuals lived and worked side by side. It was here that a massive translation project began. Scholars traveled to Spain to learn Arabic so they could translate the complete works of Aristotle, along with the brilliant commentaries of Arab thinkers like Averroes and Avicenna, back into Latin. It was one of the most fruitful cross-cultural collaborations in history, a powerful reminder that knowledge isn't picky about what language it speaks. The arrival of this new Aristotle in Paris and Oxford was like a controlled intellectual explosion. Here was a complete rational system for understanding the entire observable world, from the movement of the stars to the nature of the human soul, all based on reason and logic. It was thrilling, it was powerful, and it was also a little bit dangerous, because how could you reconcile this rational system with the mysteries of the Christian faith? This challenge gave rise to a new method of thinking, scholasticism. The goal of a scholastic thinker was to take two apparently contradictory statements, say a quote from the Bible and a passage from Aristotle, and using an ironclad system of logic show how they could both be true. It was like the world's most complicated high-stakes debate club. And the undisputed grandmaster of this method was a quiet, hulking Italian Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas. His masterwork, the Summa Theologica, or Summary of Theology, is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever undertaken. It's not a book you read from cover to cover. It's more like a giant, beautifully organised FAQ page for God, man, and the entire universe. His method was rigorous and honest. For any given question, say, "Does God exist?" he would begin by listing all the best arguments against the position he was about to take. He'd give his opponents their strongest voice. Only then would he state his own position, beginning with the famous words, "I answer that." He would lay out his proof step by logical step. And then he would circle back and refute every one of the initial objections one by one. It was a stunning display of intellectual confidence and rigour. This was the new sound of learning. It wasn't the quiet scratch of a quill. It was the noisy, passionate, and sometimes combative sound of debate. The era of passive preservation was over. The era of active critical inquiry had begun. The light wasn't just being kept alive in a jar anymore. It was being used as a lens to re-examine everything. So we've journeyed from the quiet scribe to the boisterous student. From the fall of an empire to the rise of universities, we've seen a world full of struggle, yes, but also overflowing with resilience, innovation, and intellectual fire. It seems almost impossible then that anyone could look back on this entire complex 1,000-year period and dismiss it with a single insulting name. So for our final chapter, we must ask the most important question of all: who came up with the name the Dark Ages and why on earth did it stick? The answer is the final piece of our puzzle, and it will bring our long journey to a close. So here we are at the end of our investigation. We have journeyed through 1,000 years of history. We've sat with the lonely scribe, walked with the weary farmer, stood in awe of the master mason, and listened to the boisterous debates of the first university scholars. We have found light in the most unexpected of places, which brings us back to the central nagging question of our entire journey. If there was all this light, all this innovation, resilience, and creation, where on earth did the name the Dark Ages come from? Who threw the switch? The answer is, in its own way, the most human part of our story. The people who lived through the era we've been exploring didn't call it the Dark Ages. Of course not. They just called it now. They saw themselves as modern people living in the world as it was. The name, the label, the judgment, that all came later. To find the source, we have to leap forward in time past the Vikings, past the Masons, past even Thomas Aquinas. We have to go to 14th century Italy, and we have to meet a man named Francesco Petrarca, whom we know today as Petrarch. Petrarch was a brilliant Italian scholar, a breathtaking poet, and more than anything else, he was an absolute obsessive superfan of ancient Rome. He loved the classical world with a passion that is hard for us to comprehend. He spent his life hunting for lost manuscripts by the Roman author Cicero. He wrote deeply personal and admiring letters to long-dead writers like Virgil and Homer, as if they were his close friends. For Petrarch, the age of the Roman Republic and early empire was a golden age of perfect language, noble philosophy, and brilliant art. It was the light. And as he looked at the 1,000 years that followed the fall of Rome, the period we've just been exploring, he felt a profound sense of loss. In his eyes, the Latin had become clumsy, the architecture was heavy and crude compared to the Colosseum, and the philosophy was tangled and strange. He saw this entire millennium as a long, sad, shadowy period of decay and gloom, a dark age of ignorance that lay between two great periods of light, his beloved classical antiquity, and his own time, which he hoped would be an age of glorious rebirth, a renaissance. It was Petrarch who first gave us this idea, this neat three-act play of history. Act 1, the brilliant shining light of Greece and Rome. Act 2, a long, dark, boring intermission of 1,000 years. And Act 3, the glorious return of the light, starring conveniently Petrarch and his humanist friends, heroically bringing classical learning back to the world. Now, was this a deliberate conspiracy to hide the truth? No. It was just a brilliant act of branding. It's a fantastic marketing pitch, isn't it? If you want your own intellectual movement to seem vital and revolutionary, it really helps to portray the era you're replacing as stagnant and miserable. You're not just a new kind of poet. You're a bringer of the dawn. It's powerful, it's compelling, and it puts you and your friends at the very center of the story. And the idea stuck. The Renaissance humanists who followed Petrarch loved it, because it made them the heroes. Later in the 16th century, Protestant reformers also found the term incredibly useful. They used Dark Ages to describe a time of what they saw as Catholic superstition and papal corruption, an era of ignorance from which they were now liberating Europe. Another generation, another group finding it useful to have a dark past to define themselves against. Then in the 18th century, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment who championed science and reason above all else looked back on the medieval period's deep focus on faith and theology and dismissed it as a time of unreason. So they too were more than happy to call it the Dark Ages. The name survived because it was simple and it told a dramatic story. It's much easier to say the Dark Ages than it is to say a 1,000-year period of immense social, political and cultural transition, characterized by both the fragmentation of old institutions and the slow, organic growth of new ones. One fits on a bumper sticker. The other is a whole textbook. So to finally answer our question, was there a cover-up? No. There was no conspiracy. No secret society hiding the truth. There was just a really effective, slightly arrogant and deeply unfair nickname coined by a man who was in love with the time-long past. The darkness was never in the era itself. The darkness was in the label. And now our long journey is nearly complete. We have found the source of the name. We've seen that the biggest cover-up in history was just a misunderstanding. All that's left is to take one last look back at the world we've explored, to gather all those scattered points of light we've discovered, and to let their collective glow warm us as we finally drift towards sleep. And so the mystery is solved. The great historical cover-up was never a conspiracy. It was just a name, a label, a trick of perspective coined by a poet who loved the distant past so much he couldn't see the beauty of the world right behind him. We've found the source of the shadow, and in doing so we can finally let it go and see the light for what it was. Our long journey is coming to an end. Before we part, let's take one last slow walk back through the world we've explored. Let's gather all those scattered points of light we found, the small flames we sheltered in our minds for the last couple of hours, and see them all at once. Let's begin where we started, in that cold, silent scriptorium. Picture the single, steady flame of Brother Thomas's candle. See the light catch the ink as he carefully forms a letter, his breath pluming in the air. His is the light of preservation. A quiet, stubborn, lonely flame burning against the entropy of the world, a defiant act of hope that someone someday would be there to read what he was writing. Now let your mind drift out into the fields. See the light of a different kind. The warm orange glow of the hearth fire in Cedric's hut. A fire that means safety from the cold, a cooked meal, a family gathered close in the smoky darkness. His is the light of survival, the light of sustenance, the light that is rooted in the earth that rises and falls with the sun that smells of wood smoke and damp soil. It is the fundamental light of human life itself. See the strange borrowed light of the family living in the shell of a Roman villa, the moonlight streaming through the collapsed roof, illuminating the faded face of a goddess on a mosaic floor. Theirs is the light of adaptation, of finding a home in the bones of a dead giant, of turning the past into a playground of pragmatism so profound it becomes a kind of poetry. Travel now across the sea to that jagged rock in the Atlantic. See the light of the Irish monk's lamp, a tiny spark against a backdrop of furious grey waves and screaming gulls. His is the light of devotion pushed to the extreme, a searing, focused point of intellectual passion protected by the very storm that surrounds it. Come back to the mainland, to the great hall of the Abbess Hilda. See the light in her eyes as she recognizes the talent in an illiterate cowherd. See the light reflecting off the golden threads of a tapestry woven by her nuns. Hers is the light of wisdom, of leadership, of nurturing. A flame that doesn't just warm itself but kindles new fires in others. See the bright, ambitious light of Charlemagne's court at Aachen. The light of 100 candles in a new palace chapel reflecting off the polished marble he brought all the way from Italy. His is the light of order, of grand ambition, of trying to gather all the world's knowledge into one place and give it a single shining form. Feel the dusty shafts of sunlight in a half-built church. The light catching the fine stone dust kicked up by a mason's chisel. His is the light of community, of shared multi-generational effort. The slow, patient, accumulative light of a faith so strong it is willing to build something it will never see finished. And finally see the bright, argumentative, almost harsh light of the new university. The light of torches in a crowded lecture hall in Paris as a young Thomas Aquinas lays out a new argument. This is the light of discovery, a brilliant, sometimes arrogant and fiercely energetic light that seeks not just to preserve but to challenge, to dissect and to understand. They are all there, the scribe, the farmer, the abbess, the mason, the scholar. They never met. They lived centuries and kingdoms apart. But tonight in our minds, they are all in the same room. Their lights are all burning together, and seen all at once, they are not just scattered sparks. They are a constellation, a brilliant, complex, and deeply human tapestry of light. And now feel the world they lived in, the cold that seeped through their wool habits and into their bones, the gnawing hunger of a long winter, the constant low-grade fear of sickness, or a bad harvest, or a sudden raid, the hardness of the dirt floor where they slept, the immense back-breaking effort of their every single day. And feel, now, the world you're in, the softness of your bed, the gentle, even weight of your blanket, the quiet, predictable warmth of your room, the silence which is not a silence of isolation but of safety, the profound, incredible peace of knowing you are secure, their struggle, their light, their quiet and noisy and desperate and hopeful work. It all built the long, winding, unseen road that leads directly to the very room where you now lie. You are the future they were building for whether they knew it or not. Rest now in the peace they could only dream of. Conclusion: the darkness was not empty. The music softens, further still becoming almost subliminal. All that should remain is a deep, peaceful, resonant hum. The story is over now. The great cover-up was a ghost, a trick of the light. The darkness was never in the past. It was in our looking. We called it the Dark Ages, not because it was devoid of light, but because it was quiet. And we in our loud and brilliant world have perhaps forgotten how to listen to the quiet. The quiet is where stories sleep. Think of the quiet of a forest floor as moss and leaves slowly, patiently grow over a forgotten Roman road. A quiet that reclaims. Think of the quiet of a library centuries ago, the only sound the soft whisper of a page being turned of knowledge passing from one mind to another. A quiet that preserves. Think of the quiet of a field at dusk after the harvest is in. The work is done. The community is fed. A deep, weary and satisfied quiet. A quiet of relief. Think of the quiet inside a great stone church late at night. The candles have been snuffed out. The prayers have been said. The air is still and cool and thick with the scent of stone and incense and time itself. A quiet of sanctuary. That is the world we have visited. A quiet world. A world where change was measured in lifetimes, not in minutes. A world where survival was a victory and a new idea was a miracle. And so it is time to let it all go. Let the characters sleep. Let Brother Thomas finally rest his tired eyes. Let Cedric's hearth fire burn down to soft glowing embers. Let the Abbess Hilda's accounts be settled for the night. Let the Viking's ship be anchored in a calm harbour. The stories have been told. They are safe now. There is nothing left to figure out. Nothing left to solve. The journey is done. All the questions have been answered. You can let your mind grow quiet too. Let it become as still and peaceful as that ancient sleeping landscape. Feel the gentle pull of your own body, the simple, easy rhythm of your breath, in and out, the slow, heavy feeling in your limbs as they sink softly into the mattress, the pleasant warmth beneath your blankets. There is only the darkness of your own quiet room now. It is not the darkness of ignorance, it is not the darkness of fear. It is a good darkness. A kind darkness, a safe darkness. It is the darkness that brings rest, the darkness that brings peace. It is time to sleep. Close your eyes. Let go. Sleep now.